7 years, that was the term. 7 years of abundant harvests before the greatest famine ever recorded in the ancient world devastated Egypt and all the surrounding nations. But no one knew. The granaries were full, the Nile overflowed with life, and the people celebrated prosperity as if it were eternal. Until a foreign prisoner revealed what no wise man could see: the plenty was merely the prelude to collapse. The account is recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 41. A narrative that spans more than 3,500 years and remains current because it speaks of vision, preparation, and the brutal difference between those who see the signs and those who are swallowed by them. Think of the scene. Egypt at that time was the greatest power in the known world, an empire that stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers along the Nile, with a population estimated between 3 and 4 million inhabitants. The pyramids were already over 1,000 years old. The temples shone with gold. The scribes recorded every sack of grain, every head of cattle, every movement of the sacred river that fed that entire civilization. And at the center of it all, one man concentrated absolute power: the pharaoh. But on that specific night, all that power meant nothing. Because the most feared ruler on earth woke up covered in sweat, with a racing heart, trying to process images that defied any known logic. Many people know fragments of this story. They have heard about the lean cows, about Joseph, about the famine, but few understand the spiritual and strategic depth of what truly happened in that period. Few realize that a pattern was being drawn there that would repeat centuries later, in the life of another man who would also be sold, betrayed, and exalted to save multitudes. If you want to go beyond the surface and understand the deeper prophetic connections between the Old and the New Testament, I have prepared a digital book called The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. In it, you will discover revelations that most people never noticed in the scriptures. To access it right now, it is very simple. Look at the screen and notice the square code that is appearing. Take your cell phone, open the camera app, and point it at this code. A link will appear automatically. Just tap on it and you will have immediate access to the book. If you prefer, the link is also in the description of this video. On your cell phone, tap the video title or the More option to see the full description. On a computer or television, the link appears just below the video. Thousands of people are already deepening their faith through this reading. By accessing it, you also help keep this channel active to continue bringing content like this. Access it now and then come back here. And if this message is touching your heart, leave an Amen in the comments, returning to that night in the Egyptian palace. The pharaoh dreamed he was by the banks of the Nile. The river was more than a source of water. It was the very identity of Egypt. Each year, its floods deposited fertile sediments that transformed the desert into arable land. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. Without its waters, millions would die. And it was precisely there, in that setting of life, that the vision began. From the calm waters emerged 7 cows. But they were no ordinary cows. They were extraordinary specimens, fat, robust, with shining coats and defined muscles. They represented the best that nature could offer. They came out of the river and began to graze peacefully in the vegetation along the banks. Up to that point, a pleasant dream. But then the scene changed. 7 other cows emerged from the same river. And the description the biblical text offers is disturbing. They were so thin that the bones showed beneath the skin, so deformed they appeared diseased, so frightening that Pharaoh himself, accustomed to seeing everything, was horrified. The Hebrew text uses an expression that can be translated as ill-favored in appearance, something that completely defied the natural. And then the impossible happened. The 7 skeletal cows advanced upon the 7 fat cows and devoured them completely. They swallowed everything, but, and here is the most disturbing detail, they did not grow fat. They remained exactly the same, thin, bony, horrible, as if nothing had been consumed. Can you dimension what that image meant? It was a violation of the most basic logic of nature. When something consumes, it should absorb. When something devours, it should grow. But no. Destruction generated no benefit. Consumption produced no satiety. It was a cycle of absolute loss. Pharaoh woke up, heavy breathing, confused mind. But eventually, he went back to sleep. And the terror repeated. This time the vision showed 7 ears of grain, full, golden, heavy with kernels. The kind of ear that made farmers smile, that filled granaries that fed families for months. But soon 7 other ears appeared, thin, withered, blasted by the east wind of the desert. And again, the weak devoured the strong. The shriveled ears consumed the abundant ones without any transformation. 2 dreams, the same message. When Pharaoh finally woke up, he could not simply ignore it and go about his routine. There was a weight in those images, an urgency he could not rationally explain, but felt in the deepest part of his being. Something was being communicated, and he needed to understand what. So he summoned all the intellectual resources of the empire: magicians, sages, diviners, royal advisors, priests of the temples, men trained for decades to interpret omens, decipher symbols, read the stars and the signs of the gods. Egypt had the best schools of esoteric knowledge in the ancient world. If anyone could interpret that dream, it would be one of these specialists. But none could. One after another, the wise men heard the account and remained silent. Some proposed vague interpretations, others admitted they did not understand. And Pharaoh became increasingly disturbed because the more he tried to find an answer, the more evident it became that this transcended available human knowledge. It was at this moment of impasse that someone remembered a seemingly irrelevant detail. The Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, an official whose function was to taste the wine before the king to ensure it was not poisoned, remembered something that had happened 2 years earlier. He himself had been unjustly imprisoned, along with the chief baker, accused of some conspiracy in the palace, and in prison both had strange dreams on the same night. There was a young Hebrew there, a slave who served the jailer, and this young man interpreted the dreams of both with absolute precision. He told the cupbearer he would be restored to his position in 3 days. He told the baker he would be executed in 3 days. And it happened exactly that way. The cupbearer was released and returned to serve the Pharaoh, but he completely forgot the young man who helped him. 2 whole years passed, 730 days in which Joseph remained in prison, waiting for the promise of being remembered to be fulfilled. 730 nights sleeping in a cell, not knowing if he would ever leave. Here is one of the most impressive dimensions of this story: time. Joseph had no guarantee of anything, no contract, no deadline, no certainty. He had only the memory of dreams he himself had in his youth, dreams in which his brothers and even his parents bowed down before him. Dreams that seemed absurd at the time, and that as the years passed, seemed increasingly impossible. How do you maintain faith when everything around you contradicts what you believe? This is a question that spans generations, and Joseph lived this tension at the most extreme level possible. Consider the trajectory of this man. He was the favorite son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac, great-grandson of Abraham. He was born into a family that carried specific divine promises. His father loved him in a special way and gave him a coat of many colors, a symbol of distinction that generated mortal envy in his 10 older brothers. At 17, Joseph had 2 prophetic dreams. In the first, he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field, and his sheaf stood up while his brothers' sheaves bowed down around it. In the second, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrated themselves before him, representing father, mother, and the 11 brothers. The reaction was explosive. The brothers already hated him for being the favorite. Now hearing that they would one day bow before him was too much. Envy turned into a murder plot. When Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers in the field, they saw the opportunity. First, they wanted to kill him. Then Reuben convinced the others to merely throw him into an empty pit, planning to rescue him later. But while Reuben was absent, Judah had another idea: to sell his brother as a slave to a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants passing through the area. The price? 20 pieces of silver. Joseph was torn from his family, from his land, from everything he knew, and taken in chains to Egypt. He was 17 years old. He did not speak the language. He did not know the customs. He was a foreigner sold as property. In Egypt, he was bought by Potiphar, a high-ranking official of Pharaoh, captain of the royal guard. And here something remarkable happened. Even in the condition of a slave, Joseph prospered. The biblical text says that the Lord was with him and that everything he did was successful. Over time, Potiphar noticed this and promoted Joseph to administrator of his entire house. But then came another trial. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph repeatedly. Day after day she pursued him. And day after day he refused, saying he could not betray his master's trust nor sin against God. Until one day she grabbed him by his garment when they were alone. Joseph fled, leaving the garment in her hands. And she, humiliated by the rejection, inverted the story. She accused Joseph of trying to violate her. Potiphar, furious, had Joseph imprisoned. From administrator of a powerful official's house to a prisoner in an Egyptian cell. From a position of trust to complete disgrace. And the most cruel part, for doing the right thing, for refusing sin, for maintaining his integrity. How long can a person maintain faith when they are punished precisely for doing good? Joseph was imprisoned for at least 2 years, possibly more, as the text does not specify how long he had already been there before interpreting the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. 2 years in an Egyptian prison of the ancient world, without trial, without a deadline, without visible hope of release. But even there, something extraordinary happened. The jailer noticed that Joseph was different. He put him in charge of the other prisoners, and Joseph managed the prison in the same way he had managed Potiphar's house, with excellence, integrity, and an inexplicable capacity to make things work. It was in this context that the cupbearer and the baker arrived at the prison. It was there that Joseph interpreted their dreams correctly. And it was there that he asked the cupbearer, "Remember me when it goes well with you. Mention my case to Pharaoh. I was brought here unjustly," the cupbearer promised. And he forgot. 2 years. Until that morning when Pharaoh woke up disturbed, no wise man could interpret, and the cupbearer finally remembered the young Hebrew in prison. Observe the speed of what happens from here. Joseph is removed from prison in haste. He shaves, because the Egyptians considered a beard a sign of slovenliness, and changes his clothes. He is taken directly into the presence of the most powerful man in the world. Think of this transition. In a matter of hours, Joseph went from a dark cell to the throne room, from a forgotten prisoner to an advisor summoned by Pharaoh himself. The change was so abrupt that it would be understandable if he were nervous, confused, or intimidated. But he was not. When Pharaoh said he had heard that Joseph could interpret dreams, Joseph's response was revealing. He did not say, "Yes, I can." He said, "It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." This phrase shows something fundamental about Joseph's character. Even after years of unjust suffering, he was not bitter. Even before the greatest opportunity of his life, he was not exalting himself. He directed all the glory to God, the same God who apparently had permitted all that pain. This is not superficial faith, this is trust forged in the fire. Pharaoh then recounted the dreams in detail. The 7 fat cows, the 7 lean cows that devoured them without growing fat, the 7 full ears, the 7 thin ears that consumed them, the repetition, the disturbance, the inability of the wise men to explain. And Joseph answered immediately. He did not ask for time to think. He consulted no one. The interpretation came with absolute clarity. The dream of Pharaoh is one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 fat cows represent 7 years. The 7 full ears also represent 7 years. They are 7 years of extraordinary abundance throughout the land of Egypt. But the 7 lean and ill-favored cows that came up after them also represent 7 years. 7 years of severe famine that will come after the abundance. And here is the most important detail. The famine will be so extreme that it will make the land completely forget all the previous plenty. Just as in the dream, the lean cows devoured the fat ones without changing appearance, the scarcity will consume all prosperity as if it had never existed. Joseph explained that the dream was repeated in 2 different forms because the matter was firmly decided by God and would happen shortly. There was no room for doubt. There was no possibility of avoiding it. What could be done was to prepare. And then something extraordinary happened. Joseph did not stop at the interpretation. Without being asked, he presented a complete strategy for national survival. Let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let supervisors be appointed to collect 1/5 of all the harvests during the 7 years of plenty. Let this food be stored in the cities under the authority of Pharaoh. Thus, when the famine comes, the country will not be destroyed. 20% of all agricultural production for 7 consecutive years, systematically stored in granaries throughout Egyptian territory. Imagine the scale of this operation. Egypt produced millions of tons of grain annually. 20% of that, multiplied by 7 years, represented a reserve capable of feeding not only the Egyptians, but entire surrounding nations. And that was exactly what Joseph was proposing. Pharaoh's reaction was immediate. He looked at Joseph and saw something that transcended administrative skill or natural intelligence. He said to his officials, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And then, in a decision that would change history, Pharaoh declared, "Since God has revealed all this to you, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in the throne will I be greater than you." In a single day, Joseph went from a foreign prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. 13 years. That was the total time since Joseph was sold by his brothers until this moment. 13 years of slavery, false accusations, imprisonment, and being forgotten. 13 years in which every day seemed to contradict the promises of those teenage dreams. But God had not forgotten. Pharaoh took off his signet ring, the symbol of royal authority, and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and made him ride in the second royal chariot, with heralds proclaiming before him. Joseph received an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, which can mean God speaks and he lives, or revealer of secrets. He also received a wife from the Egyptian nobility, Asenath, daughter of an important priest. And then, at 30 years of age, Joseph began to execute the plan he had proposed. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, supervising the collection of grain. The production was so extraordinary that the biblical text says the earth brought forth by handfuls. The granaries filled, new warehouses were built, and Joseph stored grain as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. This expression is not merely poetic. It indicates a logistical operation of monumental proportions, construction of silos, transport systems, inventory management, quality control to prevent the grain from spoiling, security to protect the reserves. Joseph was essentially creating the first national strategic reserve in documented history. And during those same 7 years, his 2 sons were born. The first he named Manasseh, which means he who makes one forget, because Joseph said, "God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful, because God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. The names revealed Joseph's inner state. He was not bitter. He was not obsessed with revenge or resentment. He recognized that God had transformed his pain into purpose and his affliction into fruit. These are details that many pass over quickly, but they carry an impressive spiritual depth. While the world around him celebrated material prosperity, Joseph was processing his past in the light of God's faithfulness. He was making peace with his history, not denying the pain, but recognizing the redemption. And it is precisely here, in the midst of this journey of personal restoration and national preparation, that we must pause for reflection. The story of Joseph is not just about storing grain or interpreting dreams. It is about how God uses the darkest moments to position his servants in the most strategic places. It is about trusting when all seems lost. It is about maintaining integrity when no one is watching. If you want to deepen your understanding of how God works through suffering to fulfill eternal purposes, do not fail to access the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. The QR code is on the screen now. Point your cell phone camera and access it, or find the link in the video description. Each access helps keep this channel on the air. And then, exactly as Joseph had predicted, everything changed. The The 7 years of abundance ended, and the famine began. It was not a gradual transition. The biblical text presents an abrupt change. Where there was plenty, there came to be scarcity. The rains that fed the headwaters of the Nile failed. The floods that fertilized the fields did not come. The soil that produced by handfuls now produced little or nothing. And it was not only in Egypt. The famine spread through all the surrounding lands. Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia. Entire regions began to face the same crisis. Populations that depended on annual harvests saw their reserves exhausted in months. Despair began to set in, but Egypt was prepared. When the Egyptian people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he answered simply, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." Joseph opened the granaries and began to sell grain to the Egyptians. The operation he had planned was working. The reserve that many likely questioned during the years of abundance was now the difference between life and death. And then foreigners began to arrive. From all directions, caravans headed to Egypt in search of food. It was the only place in the known world that had food to sell. Joseph became not only the administrator of a nation, but the controller of the food supply for an entire region. Among these caravans, a specific group descended from the land of Canaan, 10 men, the 10 older brothers of Joseph. More than 20 years had passed since they threw him into a pit and sold him to traveling merchants. More than 2 decades since they stained the colored coat with animal blood and deceived their own father, saying Joseph had been devoured by a wild beast. Jacob never recovered. The biblical text says he refused to be comforted and declared he would go down to Sheol, to the grave, mourning for his son. The mourning never ended. The wound never closed. And now, forced by famine, these same brothers were bowing before the governor of Egypt, begging for permission to buy grain. They had no idea who that man was. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. After all, Joseph was dressed as an Egyptian, spoke through an interpreter, used an Egyptian name, and occupied a position that no Hebrew had ever held. The idea that this powerful governor was the teenage brother they had sold was simply inconceivable. And here begins one of the most emotionally intense sequences in the entire Bible. Joseph did not reveal himself immediately. Instead, he initiated a series of tests. He accused them of being spies. He demanded they bring the youngest brother, Benjamin, the only other son of Rachel, Joseph's mother. He imprisoned Simeon as a guarantee. He secretly returned the money they had paid, putting it back into the sacks of grain, which terrified them. Why did Joseph do this? The text does not explicitly explain, but the narrative suggests he wanted to verify if his brothers had changed. He wanted to know if they were still capable of abandoning a brother. He wanted to test their hearts before revealing himself. The brothers returned to Canaan and told everything to Jacob. The father was devastated. He had already lost Joseph and Simeon. Now they wanted to take Benjamin. It was too much. "You have bereaved me of my children," Jacob said. "Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me." But the famine continued. Eventually the grain ran out, and the only option was to return to Egypt with Benjamin. Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, offered himself as surety for Benjamin. He promised his father he would guarantee the boy's safety with his own life. This change in Judah is significant. The man who once treated his brother's life as negotiable merchandise was now willing to sacrifice himself for another brother. When the 11 brothers arrived in Egypt, Joseph received them in his house. He ordered a banquet to be prepared. He released Simeon. He asked about their aged father. And when he saw Benjamin, his full brother, the other son of Rachel, Joseph was overcome by such intense emotion that he had to rush to a private room. And he wept. This detail deeply humanizes Joseph. Despite all the power, all the authority, all the achievements, he was still a man who felt longing, who carried emotional scars, who loved his family despite everything they had done. But the test was not yet over. Joseph ordered that his special silver cup be hidden in Benjamin's sack of grain. When the brothers departed, he sent guards after them. The cup was discovered, and they were all brought back, accused of theft. The penalty for this crime would be slavery, specifically for Benjamin. in whose possession the cup was found. And it was here that the moment of revelation happened. Judah stepped forward and made a speech that is considered one of the most moving passages in the Old Testament. He told the whole story from the family's point of view. He spoke of the aged father who lost a beloved son and would now lose another. He spoke of the promise he had made to protect Benjamin. And then he offered himself. "Let me stay as a slave in place of the lad," Judah said. "Let the lad go back with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? I cannot bear to see the evil that would come upon my father." Joseph could no longer restrain himself. He ordered all the Egyptians to leave the room. And then, alone with his brothers, he began to weep so loudly that the Egyptians outside heard, and the news reached Pharaoh's house. And he said in Hebrew, in the language he had not used for more than 2 decades, "I am Joseph, does my father yet live?" The brothers were paralyzed with terror. The text says they could not answer, for they were dismayed at his presence. Think of this moment. The brother they had sold as a slave now controlled whether they would live or die. The arrogant teenager of the dreams about sheaves and stars was now the most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, and they were completely at his mercy. But Joseph did not seek revenge. Instead, he said something that reveals a deep understanding of divine providence. "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." This declaration does not minimize the brothers' sin. Joseph did not say it was nothing or I deserved it. He explicitly recognized that they meant evil, but he also recognized a greater hand behind all events, a providence that redirected even human malice toward a purpose of salvation. Joseph sent for his father and the entire family. He offered them the best land in Egypt, the region of Goshen, so they could settle during the remainder of the famine. Pharaoh not only agreed, but provided wagons and provisions for the move. When Jacob received the news that Joseph was alive, the text says, "His heart fainted, for he did not believe them." The shock was too great. But when he saw the wagons sent, when he heard the exact words Joseph had spoken, something changed within him. "It is enough," Jacob said. "Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob's family that went down to Egypt totaled 70 people. This number would be the beginning of something much larger. During the next 430 years, before the Exodus led by Moses, this group would multiply until it became a nation of millions. All because a young man maintained faith during 13 years of injustice. All because a prisoner interpreted a dream that no wise man could decipher. All because a slave sold for 20 pieces of silver was positioned by God to save the known world from destruction. The famine lasted the full 7 years, exactly as Joseph had predicted. During this period, people from all nations came to Egypt to buy food. Egypt's power and influence grew enormously. Joseph managed the entire operation with wisdom, ensuring that the granaries never emptied completely and that distribution was controlled. When it finally ended, the land began to produce again. The Nile overflowed once more. The fields turned green. Life returned to normal. But nothing would truly be the same. A Hebrew family was now established in the heart of Egypt. The seeds of an entire nation had been planted in foreign soil, and the pattern of a savior who passes through suffering, rejection, and exaltation before rescuing his people was etched into history. The famine passed. Egypt survived. Joseph reunited with his brothers and forgave those who had sold him as a slave. What seemed like destruction revealed itself as preparation. What seemed like abandonment was positioning. Centuries later, another man would be sold by someone close to him. He would also be wronged. He would also descend to the lowest place before being exalted. He would also save multitudes from famine, not physical, but spiritual. Jesus Christ fulfilled the pattern that Joseph only anticipated. The grain that falls into the earth and dies produces much fruit. Perhaps you are living your own period of imprisonment. Perhaps the dreams around you seem incomprehensible. But there is a God who transforms dungeons into palaces and nightmares into strategies of salvation. The question is not whether he is acting, it is whether you can see it. We have reached the end of another journey through the Scriptures, And the story of Joseph leaves us with a truth that spans the centuries. God writes straight with crooked lines. The boy sold by his brothers became the savior of the family that rejected him. The forgotten prisoner became the governor of an entire nation. The despised dreamer saw every detail of his visions fulfilled, not despite the suffering, but through it. If this message touched your heart and you want to go deeper into the revelations of the Scriptures, I invite you to access the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, now. The QR code is appearing on the screen at this moment. Take your cell phone, open the camera and point it at the code. When the link appears, just tap to access. If you are on your cell phone, you can also tap the title of this video and open the description. The link will be there. On a computer or television, the link is just below the video. By accessing it, you deepen your faith and also help keep this channel active to continue producing content like this. Access it now. And if the story of Joseph spoke to you today, leave an Amen in the comments and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message.